We're learning Hilchos Megillah, Perek Beis, Halacha Yud Aleph, Daf Ayin Gimel. We go to the Peirush HaMeir. The Megillah needs Shedei Tfur Kulat Shiur Kol Yosero Megillah Achas. It has to be sewn together with the sinews or other threads we'll see until it's all one Megillah. And the Ein Tfur Ela Begidden, and it can only be sewn together with the sinews of the animal. Keseva Torah. And if it was sewn with some other material, it is possible. Hilchos Torah, Rambam explains when you bind the different sections of the Sefer Torah together, you do not do it only except using gidden, which is sinews of an animal, and it has to be either kosher domesticated animal or even of a wild animal like a deer. Even if it's not slaughtered and it's a treifa, still it's that's considered a kosher animal. And you do it with the same. If you look at this tefillin, you'll see it has the same type of thread, which is made out of the sinews of an animal. This is Halacha Moshe Sinai. Therefore, if he did it with anything else, or he used an animal which was not kosher, meaning other than a sheep, any of the family that chew their cud and have split hooves, it's possible until he will take it apart and redo it the way it's supposed to be done. The Rambam continues, "When it's all litvoyers kol ha'yiriyos begidden kesefer Torah." But Megillah is a little different. That you don't need to have all of the sections of parchment detached with totally. Even if he did only three, he went through three times through the connecting point. It's different if you had three tviras in one end, and three in the middle, and three at the end. It's kosher. Meaning, you have to do all of the area all the way up from bottom to the top with sinews. Megillah, you leave a little bit on top and on the bottom, which is open. Magen Mishnah cites Megillah. Amar Megillah nikras sefer. Megillah is called a sefer, not shenema v'nichtov b'sefer. As it says in Megillah Esther, it should be written in a sefer. Nikras igeras, but it's also called a letter as opposed to a book. Remember, a book in their times was a scroll. Shenema igeras ha-Purim. This letter that's found in Teshov Tes. Therefore, some of the laws applying to it are like a Sefer Torah, that if you did it with flax or linen thread, it's possible. And some of them, laws are like in Igeres, that if you put in three gidden, three sinews, three times you sewed it with sinews, it's kosher. The Rebbe explains Divrei Reb Nachman, V'vachi Mushuloshim, that he says it has to be thrice, meaning two at the two ends of the rear lamalo lamato, ve'echad be'emtza. The Rif explains it that it means that you have to have on the connecting point one connection at the top, a connection at the bottom, connection in the middle. Whereas the Rambam explains he has to have at the top three, in the middle three, in the bottom three. Rashi explains that the difference from the top of the cloth. Rashi explains that the distance between the top of the sheet of parchment until the first stitch should be as distant as to the second one, and from the second to the third should be the same distance till the end. So you really have only three on the page, and therefore there's a distance between them that's equivalent. Agos Maimonides brings from Chuvas Maram Ortenberg. Rabbeinu Tam writes, Megillah is Keseva Torah, except for the one din, that if you put into it 3 chutei gidin, it's kosher mishum because it's called anigeres. Mizach the Sefer it's brought down, the Sefer Torah needs to be written b'merchak shavos, they have to be equivalent, and v'roichev, and the width of them should be the same, and 3 times. The mishpachosim, each amud should be the same size. Reichav amud, how wide should each column of the writing be? It should be the word lemishpachosim 3 times. That's the maximum on the line. With bein shura l'shura, and how much space should it be between one line and the other? It could be the distance of one line, and between letter and letter, like one small letter. And every ois has to have around it parchment, and it can't touch the next one. And you should leave a part of the sheet empty above 3 widths of a finger, and on the bottom 4 widths. Between page to page, column to column is 2 finger widths. In time, this is the same rule would apply to Megillah, but all the Megillah's parshas are called stumois and not psuchos. Stum is when the line is not clear at the end. Like here, when we end the paragraph, we have empty space. That's a psucha. It's open all the way to the end. Stum means that it's blocked off at the end. That's what he means over here. And you leave at the end of the Megillah space of a cloth, 1 column, in order to have 1 amud that you roll on top of. And in the beginning, the leftover space has to be in order that when the Megillah is finished and you roll it up, that will cover the entire written part. It won't be written part until you get to the end of it. And every letter of the Sefer of a Megillah has to be just like the letters of a Sefer Torah. Oy Samach, he adds that we find that Rashi, the Shemush Loshim, means like the Gimel Ori Miklat Sheberetz Yisrael. That meaning not at the top and in the middle at the bottom, but rather it should be a quarter of the way up. That in between each stitch, there'll be from the empty space from the top till the first stitch, or from the first stitch to the second stitch, or from the second stitch to the third stitch, and then from the third stitch to the bottom, there should be the same spaces. And he brings to Rabbeinu Simcha that it's better to tie it with pishton, with flax thread, turn the page, bein chutei agidin, between these threads which are sinews, rather than to leave it open, because it should be well sewn. And even though as an igeris it's enough 3, but it's better to do it to fill in the empty space with pishton. We're turning the page to Ayin Hey, and we're going down to the bottom. The Kedushas Levi cites the question of the Torah Shmuel. It says likhois v'loy lichtov. Why, if the obligation of the Mikra Megillah is to read it, why shouldn't it be yotze if you did not do it from the writing? And the answer is everybody is obligated to tell them and to tell and to bless and to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the nes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for him. Somebody comes to a place where there was a nes, he has to make a bracha, even if it was for his father, the nes. That's why you find, like Satma does on the Yom, that they were saved from World War II. And then he reads the Megillah and tells the Nisei Hashem, he does a mitzvah and appears from Nisei, but it's not among the klal of Nevi'im and Ksuvim. It should be called like Oisik and Torah, therefore it's not Metami Yadayim. You don't save it from a fire until he's told Beruach HaKodesh that he's talking about a sefer. That's one of the ksuvim. Therefore, in Megillah there's an of Pirsuminis of making it known. And he doesn't do it in a sefer Mikizvi HaKodesh. And why then? Therefore, we understand the answer to the Teis Shmuel's question. It only says in Ruach HaKodesh that you should read a Betzibor from the writing and in how the Gidim are done. And the other Dinim, in order to let this be known. But it's not like Torah that you have to put it among the Kizvei Kodesh. And the one who reads it a whole year should be considered like reading Torah. And therefore, the din of it's written with Kizvei Kodesh, it's Matame Yadayim, because since it's written together, and it has a mitzvah's limud Torah, and you do save it on Shabbos because it's different than any other Megillah, because it has a din like a Gufei Torah. So he's saying here, basically what the Peirush Levi is saying is that even though there is a concept of of writing, but the main obligation is Pirsuminis, and therefore it has a bit of a difference from Torah, a regular Sefer Torah, and therefore if you read part of it Baal Peh, as we learned earlier, you yoitze, and therefore you read it from a chumash. If you're missing the minority of the Megillah, you're yoitze. We'll go to the next page. Here we're going to Daf Ayin Vav. We're also going to the bottom. The Rambam is the opinion that the Megillah you need to have the parchment worked lishma. According to his opinion, that it's the making it lishma doesn't have to do with the idea that you have to set it aside from the beginning for a certain purpose, but rather that you have to add the spirituality to it, like by a Sefer Torah, just like you do by tzitzis. Tzitzis are strands, but when you put them together, when you say the Shem Kedusha tzitzis, therefore, in Megillah, you have all the dinim of Sefer Torah, and it doesn't have to do with its sanctification, but rather inserting the Kedusha into it, and therefore it has to be Ibul Lishma. Now, Halacha Tez, he says, you don't write the Megillah only with Yoy, on the Gdil, we said, or on the Klav, like a Kiss Sefer Torah. And you need to have the lines like the Torah itself. And we learned that, and it says Frankel, and some additions we find that it doesn't say literally like Sefer Torah, but rather Kiss Sefer Torah. But we have a difference between like a Sefer Torah and whether it's on the Siyatut is literally like a Sefer Torah. The difference whether it's just akin to or totally so. Go to the next page. We're learning in Halacha Yud Aleph, Ayin Zayin, the Maggid Mishnah Nagos Maimonides cite Megillah. It says Dvar Shalom ve'emes, that you need Siyatut, just like Torah's emes. It's interesting, Torah's emes, the Aleph is from Anochi, the Mem is from Mishnayos Me'emesai, and the Tov is from Toni. Shimon, Tonei Chikoi, Reb Shimon, Mefarish, Kisefer Torah Atzma. Rashi is Mefarish like a Sefer Torah itself. Shas Sirtut Aloch LaMoshe Mitzina. That's a Sirtut by Sefer Torah Aloch LaMoshe Mitzina. In Megillah 19a, it says in Megillah it's called Seven, it's called Igeras, like we learned before. And Tosis asks a question: if Sirtut Megillah is learned from Sefer Torah, why did they have to learn from Devei Shalom v'Yemes, but not from what it says that Megillah is called Sefer? Therefore, Tosis is the opinion that Sefer Torah doesn't need Sirtut. Amita Shel Torah is Mezuzah. Sirtut Bo, that's Halacha L'Moshe Messina. So we have a disagreement here as to whether Sirtut is, whether there's an obligation of Sirtut by Sefer Torah, but today everybody does Sirtut. In Sefer Torah, Rambam Oimer Tziras Sirtut b'Torah Kit Torah Atzmo, Ve'einen nitperos ela begiden kisefer Torah. Just like Rashi, the din of Siyot of Megillah is learned from Sefer Torah, not from Mezuzah. Like his opinion, he holds true that Siyot of Sefer Torah is Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So we see the Rambam was also the opinion like Rashi that Siyot in Sefer Torah is Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We turn the page to Ayin Ches, the Magen Mishnah cites from Megillah, 16b. Omar Abzera, Oiz Vov, it also has to be long, because they were all hung in one shot. At the Temenei Homon, one was hung below the other. And furthermore, the Gemara says that the 10 Bnei Homon are written like we do the shiur, Ariach al gabi Ariach, Leveino al gabi Leveino, meaning there's a separation. You'll see it's two columns actually. The Magen Mishnah explains it means be'ez, that by Bnei Haman has to be written one on top of the other. It's called Ariach. It's called like a brick. Hizeh tzar, because it's thin. The Ilush Meseyan Shem Milim Rechavois, their names which are very, very long, Nikron Leveino al Gabi Leveino. And he asks the question, that's called Leveino rather than Ariach, which is, Leveino is more like a block. And he asks the question why the Rambam doesn't bring it. Maybe he has a different Peirush in this. The Hilchos Megillah cites the Gemara in 17b. Why Bnei Om they write in this way? So that they shouldn't be able to get up from their downfall. The Hilchos Gedolos explains like the Magen Mishnah. What does Ariach mean? Es. And Leveino means the names of Mosdos, the Alpha, and Svoso. Ki Ariach is a half of a Riach, a brick is half of the size of a block. Now, Hilchos Megillah adds, we find by the Lamed Aleph Malachim that Yeshua and Shiur Hazinu that's the way it was done. But Rashi explains Ariach, that's the written part. The Leveino is where the parchment is not written on. Rabbi Brisk explains these are not specific laws by the Megillah. They're based on Mosdos. As we find in Sefer Torah, there's a Mosdos of letters which are written big and which ones are written small. And there are oisius that are different. Look in Hilchos Sefer Torah, that the Yesodam is Mosdos ish mipi ish. Therefore, the Rambam is the opinion that the reason why it's written in this way, if you come to write a Megillah as a Ksav Kodesh, what was written b'Ruach Kodesh, b'Nevuah, through Machon Nesher HaGadol, that's why there are certain laws to it and how they should be written. But Megillah is different. And you can't have a din of Ksivas Kodesh, and it doesn't say, it's not established because it was written b'Ruach HaKodesh, and he writes, it's not the Gabi Ksivas Megillah, that's a din of Kisvei Kodesh, and therefore you don't have a Mosdos. It's only those things which are written b'Ruach HaKodesh, but in Ksav HaKodesh. And furthermore, one can add that the Rambam is of the opinion that these dinim, how to write shiur, and so the oisius, only when Ksiva is where you have psuchos and stumos, like tzura shira. But by Ksivas Megillah we don't find this, because we learned earlier everything is done stumos. And in Bryce it says that all of the shirois, anything that's a shir is written Ariach al gabi Leveino, meaning a short and then a long. Leveino al gabi Ariach, except for Ases Bnei Homon, doesn't mean because of the Halacha of Ksubis Megillah, Ela Kizri Kodesh. Therefore, the Rambam explains the Bnei Homon that I mentioned in the Brisa is with the din that are written like Kizri Kodesh, and it doesn't have to do with the din of Megillah. And there, if he leaves it out, and the Griz writes that the din of Ksivas Kizvei Kodesh is not mentioned in the Rambam, that they are dinim atluyim b'mesoros. And the Oyer Zerua cites the mesoros of all the parashas that are in the Megillah, which is Psucha, which is Stuma, and he ends that the parashas Loi Shomayim Psichos Stumos. And it would seem they're all Stumos, like Tefillin Mezuzah. And the Rebbe Bris asks a question, we have a mesoros, so many psuch, he says there are so many parashas that are, some parashas are psuchos. How can you say that all of them are stumos and then say that some of them are psuchos? And he explains that the mesoros, whether the parashas psuchos or stumos, was said when you write it in the Torah, because they're kodesh. In the Hilchos Megillah, there's no mesoros, and there is always not clear what's it in the parashas as far as, and we'll turn the page, as far as the writing of the Megillah, where you have to do a psuchos and stumos, and therefore he says, you learn until the mezuzahs, that there all of them are stumos, that they're all stumos. Shulchan Aruch Paskins. In Shulchan Aruch Paskins, you do all the parashas stumos, and the Grora explains, because it's called the Nigeris, and I don't understand what's Nigeris have to do with psuchos and stumos, and the Brisker Rav explains, since it's called Igeres, has a din of ksiva b'fnei atzmo, and therefore it needs to have all the parashas stumos. Halacha l'maishu, what do we do? Shulchan Aruch Paskins. You can only write the Megillah with ink on gvil or ala klaf, not on the side that has the hair, not on the side that has the meat. Like a Zevet. If you wrote it with me'afatzim v'kankantum, it's kshero. But if you used other colors, it's possible. And you need to have siltut, like a Torah. And but the oil does not have to be worked l'shem Megillah. And there are those that say that you should be worked l'shem Megillah. It was written on paper or on leather that wasn't completely, a skin that wasn't made into leather, or a goy wrote it, or apikoros, it's possible. It's like I say, also with regard to having space around the letters, all of the different letters, how they're written, and which words are complete and are full, and which ones have letters like the Vav missing. But the Rambam says, "B'di'evan, you can't pass on Megillah because of chaseros v'yaseros, because it's no worse than if you said if you left out something, it's still kosher as long as you said the majority of the Megillah." Mechaber adds, it needs imud at the end, meaning to have a space of one amud at the end, and chalak empty at the beginning, to have it surround the whole Megillah. And there are those who say that needs tagin, the crowns on the letters. And they'll say you don't need it. The Rambam says that they did make tagin for it, and they know it was a noig to have imud. They didn't have an imud at the end, but you could redo it till the very. In other words, the last section could be literally at the end of the sheet of parchment. Mechaber continues. As says you have to write them like shiur, not like the other shiurs where you usually have one sitting on two, but you leave empty between one side and the other. And if you didn't do so, it's possible, because this is din of Gemara. You have to make the vav vayizos long. The Gemara says b'ksivoso, and some say you also have to make it long when you read it. And the Mishnah Berurah explains that you have to have his head a little bent to show that they were all hung, bent over. And there are those who explain that you shouldn't say v'yizoso, or say v'shatz, rather v'yizoso. And he brings from the Rushi Sod. Today we're knowing, like those who say, V Shavai also should be large because the Rosh wrote it. Mechaber completes his statement by saying you have to write Ish at the beginning. Therefore, at the end of the shura, you start off. Ish is the first word on the daf, and S is at the end of the line, and at the end of the page you write Aseres. And the Mishnah Berurah adds, if he didn't make the vav long, or he wrote after Aseres another shura, it's kosher, meaning he didn't. Those are machmer not to read from it for the tzibur. Sha'afayim is of the opinion if there's a different Megillah that's written correctly, you shouldn't read from it l'chatchila but tzibur, or only if it's going to be a long way for the tzibur to wait until they get a good sefer to Megillah. There are those who have the opinion that the Aseres B'nei Haman has to be a separate page that's not, it doesn't have any other sukkim on it, and there's only 11 lines on it. The Gemara says it's also to do that. So it comes out that all the letters of Aseres B'nei Haman are bigger than the regular words of the Megillah, because in order you have to have around it more parchment, and we don't find it. Therefore, he said you should write the other shuras of the Megillah above that Omud, so that you'll, on the bottom part of the Omud, you'll find it that way, but we don't do it that way. Mishnah Berurah says the Minig Yisrael is to write Ish at the beginning, at the daf, and Aseres at the end, and you should write it long letters, that every oyis should have a few lines, as much as you need to be able to have it even throughout the page, and they should be longer, they shouldn't be thicker. Sha'afayim says the Minig Yisrael is to write Ish at the beginning of the daf, and beginning of the line. What we write, Aseres B'nei Haman ba'oisis gedolos, since they're written in a separate page, we don't column. We don't care that the previous column, the later column, is a different size. But still, Sha'atzian is of the opinion, if you did it according to the Gra, that you said Ish in the middle of the column in order to keep the last 12 lines the same size as the first 12 with the other columns. But yeah, but you can read in it. And Piskei Tshuva writes that that's also the thought of the Sam Sofer, like the Gra. The Mahadran, like a Megillah, that every Omud has only 11 lines. And therefore, you have no problem because everything is 11 lines like the Gra, and they keep them in Yisrael. But then they have a problem of making a melech at the top of each column, which seems to also be a Minig Yisrael.